Religion clearly plays a diminished role in Canadian society compared to even a few decades ago, but new polling suggests the reasons for that aren't entirely obvious or what you might expect. In fact, it's not even clear that people connect God and religion as they once did. Let's find out more with, in the nation's capital, Sarah Kathleen Johnson, professor of liturgy and pastoral theology at St. Paul's University. In London, Ontario, Alyshea Cummins, instructor of religion in the College of Humanities at Carleton University. And here in our studio, Michael Higgins, inaugural Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College at U of T. And it's great to have you back here in that chair. I haven't seen you in a long time. And to our guests and Points Beyond, thank you for joining us tonight on TVO as well. The story that many of us are, quote unquote, losing our religion has been around for a long time. Music fans will know REM sang about it 30 years ago, but a recent poll by the Association of Canadian Studies offers some new ways of thinking about this, and we got a lot of numbers that we're going to lay on you right now, so get comfy, everybody, and here we go. Sheldon, if you would. Do Canadians believe in God? Apparently, 51% said they strongly or somewhat agree that we do. 27% somewhat or strongly disagreeing, 22% not knowing. However, when Canadians were asked about how attached they are to their particular religions, 34%, just a little over a third, say they are very or somewhat attached, whereas nearly 60% say they're not very attached at all. And if we break up those numbers by particular religious traditions, the percentage of strong believers by religion in Canada, Muslims top the list at almost 90%, Protestants at 58%, strong believers in their religion. Catholics, I hate to tell you, Michael, only 40%. Jews, barely a quarter, 26%. And let's do one more. When we look at the gap between belief and religious practice, among Muslims, the gap is 26%. The same among Protestants, 26%. Among Catholics, 22%. And among Jews, the gap is minus 15%. So to summarize, more Muslims, Protestants, and Catholics believe in God rather than practice their faith, while with Jews, the picture is the opposite. More practice their religion than believe in God. Okay, Michael, do you see in these numbers, not as a loss of faith in God, but as a loss of interest in practicing the rituals of religion?
Well, I think, Steve, there's been a decline in attachment or affiliation for decades. This is not new. We've had several surveys. We have commentators, sociologists, various analysts who try to make sense of the data. And the latest material is puzzling to a little degree, as surveys of this kind often are because they leave out as much as they include. But they are a signpost, and they are a metrics we should take seriously. My sense is that people have increasingly disengaged from official practice, perhaps minimizing their attendance, but not eliminating it. There'll be certain high points in the year in which they'll re-engage. This speaks to some of the research that Sarah has done. But also, it raises the rather critical issue I don't see most of us addressing yet, quite frankly, and that is just simply observing how these trends unfold, what it means in terms of its eviscerating capacity as a cultural force.
What does that mean?
It means that religion, religio, religiare, means a ligament. It's a thing that binds or holds together, not just ritual or conviction, but it's a bonding element. David Jones, the great Welsh poet and painter, once said of religion that as a ligament, if it's cut and it's not allowed to heal, it atrophies. And as a consequence, the corpus becomes a corpse. And perhaps that's exactly where we are right now. How do we heal the ligament that is religion in a multivariegated, dysfunctional, in some respects, disunified, and riven society like we have right now?
Let's get some wisdom from out of town. Alyshea, to you first. You've contributed to studies of religious and spiritual identity among younger adults in Canada, and I wonder what your conclusions were regarding the gap between faith and religious practice?
You know, it's becoming increasingly difficult to transmit religion across generations in Canadian society, and we're finding this in other countries as well. And so, you know, the silent generation, for example, they kind of grew up in a Canadian society where religion was still a matter of fact, right? So like their peers would have been religious, society may have reinforced some of these ideas, but now we're in a growing secular society where it's not being reinforced, around Canada in our institutions, in our education. And so you see people starting to leave religion. And then, kind of what Dr. Higgins was saying is that, you are no longer practicing the forms of religion, and you're no longer passing on those forms of religion. So as the forms decrease, like attendance and prayer, it decreases across generations because they're just not growing up in that kind of practicing environment. Yeah.
Sarah, I regret to report that there's an Anglican researcher who has crunched the numbers on this, and that researcher has said that if things continue the way they are, the Anglican Church is going to run out of members by the year 2040. That's not very long away. In your view, is that because of what? A crisis of faith? Because going to church every weekend has stopped being important to people? I don't know. What?
I do think it's key to recognize that religion is a multidimensional phenomenon. It includes practice, it includes belief, it includes affiliation. These are standard ways that we look at religion sociologically. And what we're looking at in this survey is primarily the relationship between affiliation and belief. We're not actually looking at data on practice here, although there is clear data indicating a decline in religious practice in terms of weekly religious service attendance. I think one of the really interesting things this data points to is the range of different ways that people relate to religion. Sometimes it's more strongly tied to belief. Sometimes it's more strongly tied to identifying, having this strong identity with the group. Sometimes it's connected to practice, either routinely or on certain occasions like holidays, or at times of life transition like birth or death, or in times of crisis. So although the role of religion in Canadian society is certainly different than it was 50 years ago, we do see this continued presence of religion in other ways. And this data points to how people are continuing to relate to religion, although perhaps in a way that's different than the assumption that to be religious is to be formally affiliated and actively practicing and morally compliant and fully believing in the way that is often assumed, but it's more nuanced for many Canadians today.
And let me do a quick follow-up with you. Cast the Net is something that you're involved in. What are you trying to do with that?
So Cast the Net is a visioning process that's led by the Diocese of Toronto, and I'm an outside consultant on this process. And it's really an effort to listen to people, to hear about how the past few years of COVID, of the pandemic, have shaped their religious experience communally within local faith communities in terms of how those churches relate to the wider community and in terms of how it's impacted individuals. And to really learn from this experience where everyone faced very quick change, very comprehensive change, and to say we need to go forward differently. How do we build on this? How do we learn from this? How do we enter the future? Drawing on this experience in a way that's really life-giving for the church, for the community, and for individuals.
Do you think you can turn around those very disturbing numbers by the year 2040?
I'm not sure that the goal is to turn around those numbers. I think the goal is to be, in the Cast the Net process, a lot of people talk about what does it look like to faithfully follow Jesus now? What does it look like to serve our communities now as the churches that are, as the people who are there, knowing that even as the tradition is smaller than it was 50 years ago, it's still a significant number of people in Toronto. There are still 200 congregations. This is still a community that can make a difference. And to embrace that reality and really live into the vision that is possible today.
Let me share with all of you a quote about the possible reason for the overall decline in religiosity. And this is the late University of Michigan professor Roger Inglehart, who had the following to say: on a blog back in 2020. Virtually all major world religions encouraged high fertility because it was necessary in the world of high infant mortality and low life expectancy that prevailed until recently for the average woman to produce 5 to 8 children in order to simply replace the population. A growing number of countries have now attained high life expectancies and drastically reduced infant mortality rates, making these traditional cultural norms no longer necessary. Michael, does that mean that being less at the mercy of nature, we do not seem to have the same need to plead for divine intervention?
No, I think the cause-effect in this argument is really quite weak. The decline of religion, particularly in the West, is not especially tied to fertility rates, although there have been controversies, of course, as you would be familiar with in Quebec, reaction to Humanae Vitae, the encyclical, the Quiet Revolution, all kinds of ways in which declining birth rates do seem to be correlated in some way with the decline of religious practice in Catholic Quebec. Although it's a minor point, really, by comparison. I think what we're facing is a shift in paradigms, in talking about religion, in what religion means. Let me give you an example. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, one time in talking about religion, said, you know, for many, religion is about renunciation, it's about duty, it's about moral imitation. He says, I think it's about the expanse of the heart, about the direction of the heart. And it does seem to me that in some important way, what we're seeing is a shift away from doctrine and a move toward ways of defining religion, piety. We use the term religiosity now, although traditionally, religiosity is an entirely pejorative term, but now it's used in sociological jargon as a way of measuring one's religious practice. But the point is, it's much more porous. It's very difficult for scholars in religious studies to be able to pinpoint in any kind of clear, systematic way what are all the things that are contributing to the reshaping of religion on the ground. But I think it is the fact that we have a reshaping happening, and the degree to which institutional religion responds to that challenge of reshaping, then you're going to see a certain fecundity of imagination and spirit. When it doesn't, when it's involved in a restorationist model, recovering the past, trolling its own history of nostalgia in order to recreate what once was the ancien regime, it's not going to work.
It seems impossible to do a program nowadays without talking, Alyshea, about ChatGPT. So we're going to do that right now. If you think about inventions such as ChatGPT, does it stand to reason that new inventions seem miraculous without appearing to be divinely inspired, and that this inevitably affects our attitudes towards religious institutions?
Yeah, I mean, that question in itself, we have to understand, is kind of very much on the side of Abrahamic religions, where they may believe in these types of miracles as well. But I wouldn't, people can, if you are a religious person, you will attribute the extraordinary as a miracle. If you are a non-religious person, you will make meaning with that in different ways, in more secular ways. But with new information technology, and I would say in social media, I think the biggest thing is that our youth today are introduced to an array of information, and they are looking to make meaning with that information, and also an array of communities. And so they may not necessarily find belonging in their religious community anymore. They may find online or other communities to which they feel a stronger sense of belonging.
And let me follow up with this. We are becoming a more multicultural country as we increase immigration, which the federal government tells us will go up to 500,000 people coming to Canada every year within a few years. Do you have a sense about how religious practice is going to evolve, get stronger, get weaker? I don't know, when Canada becomes even more multicultural than it is.
Yeah, and again, this kind of has to do with the being introduced to diversity and looking at different worldviews, and then rethinking about what your own worldviews look like in comparison to other people's. Just with multiculturalism, we know that our youth, especially the millennial generation, this comes up on surveys, they highly value multiculturalism, and that's whether they're an immigrant tradition or a non-immigrant tradition. Now, it can also have another effect where, because of this multiculturalism and maybe this cognitive dissonance that you get with all this diversity, you may retreat back into your community, right? So sometimes it can have that other effect and strengthen community bonds in the face of multiculturalism. But for the most part, we are seeing religions transform to be able to accept religious diversity. You see this kind of pluralistic ethic, that values diversity, and you're seeing the young religious make space, and the young non-religious make space for this diversity.
Sarah, can I get you on that as well? What do you see happening to religious observance as we become more multicultural?
Yes, well, I'd really affirm what's already been said, but I would add that in addition to thinking about dialogue, mutual learning, the ways that people of different religious traditions relate to each other, it's increasingly important to pay attention to the way that people who are non-religious and who are religious relate to each other, and the kind of dialogue that can unfold among people who relate to religion in different ways, as we see in this poll. That these different ways of being religious are another point of mutual learning, mutual dialogue, and will themselves change the way that people believe and practice and identify.
Michael, does the average Canadian ever ask him or herself, there are so many religions out there, how do I know if mine's the right one?
Well, I think if you ask yourself that kind of question, that reflects a certain theological platform on which you're operating. I think to confirm what has been said by interlocutors here, we have greater diversity, greater respect for alternate religious traditions than our own. And this seems to be built into the larger cultural fabric here in Canada for all kinds of reasons. And I think that is a good thing. As a consequence, I don't think you come across many people, certainly within the Catholic Church in recent years, who would subscribe to the view that outside their church there is no salvation. I think since the Second Vatican Council, there's been a real effort to understand the holiness inherent in other traditions and to respect it.
Not every religion feels that way.
No, exactly. Not every religion does, and not every Catholic does, and not every Catholic leader does either. But I do think that is a significant and continually fermenting result of the Council, which has helped Roman Catholics, at least, in the context of Canada, and we're talking particularly about our context here, to value the multi-faith, multi-perspectival response to religion that we have in society. I just want to use this one example. It's a minor anecdote, and I don't know if it is true for Sarah and Alyshea, but it is certainly true for me. I have a conjoined position, and I have had for many years as a professor. I'm an English professor, but I'm also cross-appointed to religious studies and theology. And when I travel, and at one point I was traveling extensively, something like 65 flights a year, so my climate footprint is alarming by every standard, as my children remind me. But one of the things that I noticed was, and I have noticed in many other contexts as well, that when I was traveling and I wanted to talk or was open to talk, I wasn't preparing some paper or something like that, and my seatmate would ask me invariably, what do you do? If I wanted to talk, I would say I'm a religious studies professor. And invariably, at any time, no matter where, they would open up. Now, whether they were interested in religion as practitioners, it didn't seem really to matter. It's that religion generates opinions. It's
Whereas if you said I'm an English professor...
Well, I said I'm an English professor, and they would always clam up. They say, well, I was not very good at grammar. I don't know the difference between a preposition and a conjunction. And so I would get the end result. They wouldn't bother me. But if I was open for conversation, and I would get crazy things. I remember one time somebody saying to me, is it true that the College of Cardinals has been taken over by Martians? And I said, well, I don't think they're an extraterrestrial operation, but there are a few that strike me as being out of this planet. You can decide which cardinal fits that category. But religion excites people, even when they don't practice. They have opinions about it,
Right.
which is not true of critical theory, for instance, in literature.
Fascinating. Alyshea, can one distinguish between religions which are more individualistic and those which are more collectivist? And do the collectivists have an easier time urging their members to practice their religion?
So I might answer this in a different direction. You see immigrant communities, often racialized or marginalized immigrant community religions. They are better at transmitting religion across generation because they are seen as others in Canadian society, right? So you have these factors that are actually influencing group belonging, right? In group belonging. But the more that I'm hypothesizing that the more that these racialized identities are accepted in Canadian society, they may start to find group belonging outside of that as well. So I really think that belonging in community, in religion, is really the glue to help transmit religion across generations.
Well, the word longing is in that word belonging. And to that end, I want to read an excerpt now. This is from an email exchange with a noted conservative substacker, N.S. Lyons. And here we go. Sheldon, top of page 5. My impression is that people today, and especially young people, are looking above all else for solid ground, for shelter in the storm. They are looking for the real and the eternal, for that which will not melt into air. They are looking for authority they can trust when authority has everywhere else dissolved. And they're looking for loyalty, community, and love that does not falter. Unfortunately, they often mistakenly turn to the worst possible places for these things, like extremist ideological movements, because they see no other alternative presenting itself. Okay, Sarah, start us off on this. Do you see this, a longing for belonging, a longing for religious faith, morphing into extreme politics, for example?
This quote does name these deep human longings for belonging, for community, for purpose. And these are areas where historically religion has played a significant role and where it continues to play a significant role for many people around the world, especially when we look outside of Canada. We really don't see a decline in religion. We would expect a growth in religion longer term. Within Canada, I'm hesitant to speak to the ways that people may be turning to politics as an alternative to religion in our own context.
Okay, Alyshea, how about you? You want to tackle that? Do you see a desire to belong, a longing to belong that can move into extremist politics, and that's somewhat, it's very disturbing.
I mean, absolutely. And I would actually frame it as people are looking for meaning in different things. So they may find meaning in populist discourse. They may also find meaning in climate activism, right? Or social justice movements. So people are finding different ways to find meaning, whether they are religious or non-religious. Religious people will find meaning in religion, and that will often inspire them to join certain activist movements. But non-religious folk, they will find meaning in other aspects of society, and that could also just be simply their work, their career, their family.
Michael, how much of a problem is that in the Catholic Church, in your view?
Well, I think it is a problem, and it's one of the reasons why we look to Pope Francis to help make sure that the ship is going in the right direction. Lyon's comment is interesting and would receive some validation from no less a figure than George Steiner. Steiner, who was comparative literature professor at Oxford and a major writer and critic, he wrote a work called Nostalgia for the Absolute, which were the Massey lectures of 1974 on the CBC. And in that, his argument was that since the 19th century, many of the organic and great religions have been evacuated of their current meaning. And so as a consequence, we have what he called substitute theologies. And so Marxism, Levi-Straussism, Darwinism, all of these are substitute theologies. And so you evacuate the old rituals, the old practices, the old doctrines, but human society doesn't flourish in a vacuum. So you have to find substitutes.
You know what else I'd put on the list today? Sports.
Yes.
Our cathedrals for sport are full all the time.
And they're fervent admirers,
with passionate
too.
people.
Absolutely, and they're given to fractious displays of enthusiasm.
Yep.
As indeed was the case with the early church. But I think in the end, what we're facing again is the problem. What happened in a generation that hyper communicates? I mean, we've got communication down to a fine art, but we don't have communion. So we're talking all the time, but do we actually connect? And one of the things that religious traditions can provide and rituals can provide is the nurturing power of silence, the natural rhythms that come with presence. And if your whole life is lived virtually for any kind of different reasons, that's an impoverishment. And that's why religion can be, and when it is at its best, a cohering factor, it brings and binds.
An Estonian-born theologian named Alexander Schmemann. Am I saying that correctly?
Alexander Schmemann, is he Orthodox theologian, isn't he?
Yeah, influential Orthodox priest, yes. He wrote the following: secularism is above all a negation of worship. It is the negation of man as a worshiping being. Okay, how optimistic are we about the future of communal religious worship? Okay, Sarah, you first.
Oh, I have no worries about the future of worship or the future of the church for at least two reasons. On a sociological level, according to the Pew Institute, the number of Christians worldwide will increase between now and 2050, and the percentage of Christians worldwide will hold steady at about 30%. There will be Christians in the world who are worshiping, who are gathering, who are meeting one another, meeting God, and sharing a meal and reading the Word of God and serving their communities. This will be ongoing. And I don't worry about it theologically either. Jesus didn't call Christians, did not call followers to build empires, but instead to partner with God in bringing about the reign of God that is more like a small seed, that is more like yeast in a loaf of bread. Christians will be doing that. And I'm part of a small minority religious tradition, the Mennonite Church, that has always been a religious minority, that has always been a small group, that has always found ways to gather and worship in small communities, and to, from that place of worship, impact their wider community in positive ways. And I don't doubt that will continue in many different traditions, and that this transformation of religion, of Christianity, of Christian worship worldwide will continue. I have confidence in this going forward.
Well, here's where the host gets a snarky follow-up, and I'll put it to you, Michael, and I say, okay, maybe, but what kind of Christians? The United Church Christians, or evangelical Christians that we see, the likes of which in the United States, who are incredibly political, sometimes support political candidates that seem somewhat inexplicable to people north of the border, et cetera, et cetera. What kind of Christians?
Well, that's a good question, Steve, but it's also complex because it's reductionist. The alternative, pitting the evangelicals against the progressives is a good media trope, but it's much more layered than that, right? It's much more complicated than that. Although it is helpful, my sense is that when it comes to worship, we're ritual animals. We're animals of theater. And certainly in the West, the theater comes out of the church. Its connection with the altar is clear, and not just in medieval theater alone. So we're ritual creating creatures. So worship will always be an important dimension or component of human meaning. When you were talking about sport as an alternate religion, you're quite right, and it has its own rituals. It has its own doctrines, its own formularies, its own chants, its ways of entry, its ways of exit. And so it kind of emulates the religious practice, which you find, if in somewhat diminished ways, still nonetheless perduring in religious cultures right across Canada. And I use the term in the plural because they are religious cultures. There are many of them.
Alyshea, can I get you to tackle that? The future of communal religious worship? How do you see it?
You know, again, religion doesn't exist in a bubble. It exists in a particular cultural context. And so depending on where you are in the world, you find that, the context can be very favorable for communal religion. I don't think communal religion is going to go anywhere anytime soon in Canada. But I mean, with the rise of non-religion and more spiritual or even individualized practices, you may start to see different trends. But again, we have to remember that immigrants also can serve favorably towards this, because as immigrants come to Canada from different religious traditions, they often kind of revive these religions and community practices.
Do you expect them, though, to become more secularized as they become more Canadian?
Again, it's really difficult to say. I do think that religion is going to transform. But again, if you're part of a community that is really trying hard not to have your religion transformed and remains kind of this stagnant, which is almost impossible kind of idea of religion, you will likely have to cut yourself off from the rest of society, or at least create very nurturing, community bubbles that kind of reinforce your worldview and ideas.
Michael, I have 30 seconds left to ask you, does religious worship in a world of digital communication necessarily have to be communal?
Well, I have difficulty with religion communicated digitally from within the Catholic context, because Eucharist is the real presence. And so it's critical to be there. I mean, it's tangible. It's physical with the full sense of that term. When it's reduced to any kind of digital mediation, there's a significant diminishment of that power and force.
Same on talk shows, incidentally.
I would think they're evidently on the decline. Or you're fighting with your writers, not you, of course.
Well, I'll tell you what. I know lately I have been hearing a significant religious chant all over the capital city of the province of Ontario. I believe it is passed down from the authorities from many, many years ago. And I looked into the scriptures so that I could convey this to everybody who's participating in this program. And I believe the doctrine is "Go Leafs Go." I think that's how it goes.
I think that's how it goes.
Pretty sure. Can I thank the three of you for appearing on TVO tonight? Sarah Kathleen Johnson, Alyshea Cummins, Michael Higgins. Great of you to join us here on TVO. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.